There's a moment in some narcissists' journeys that Jordan Peterson describes as the Great Awakening, not a gentle spiritual awakening, but a brutal, devastating revelation about the true impact of their actions on the lives of real people. It's like waking up from a dream where you were the hero and discovering that in reality you've been the villain in hundreds of different stories. Peterson has documented these rare moments of genuine awakening throughout his career, and what he's discovered about the psychological process when narcissists finally really see the wounds they've inflicted will shock you about the transformative nature of delayed empathy and the limits of what the human mind can endure when confronted with the totality of its own destructiveness. If you want to understand what's really going on inside a narcissist's mind when the mask falls, subscribe to the channel, like it, and comment below if you already suspected that one day this collapse would happen. Narcissistic awakening isn't a gradual realization or intellectual understanding. It's a visceral and devastating experience that Peterson compares to what soldiers experience when they finally fully process the impact of their actions during war. Except that for narcissists, the war was conducted against people who tried to love them, support them, and build relationships with them. Imagine por un momento, not just knowing intellectually que você hurt people, but suddenly being able to feel, literally feel, the pain you caused as if it were your own. Imagine being able to see your daughter's face, not through the filter of your own needs or justifications, but through the eyes of a child who desperately wanted parental approval, instead received manipulation, criticism, and emotional abandonment for years. Peterson, baseando-se em deep understanding of neuroplasticity e empathy development, descobriu que when narcissistas experience genuine awakening, their brains undergo what can only be described as empathy explosion. Regions responsible for emotional processing, que were essentially dormant para decades, suddenly become hyperactive. And like turning on a light switch in a room que has been dark para so long que your eyes cannot handle the sudden brightness, mas você consegue imaginar the psychological shock of suddenly experiencing empathy for dozens, hundreds of people você systematically hurt over decades? According to recent studies in neuroscience of emotional processing, this kind of rapid empathy activation can be literally overwhelming. Para brains can never developed normal empathy regulation systems, and no unlike what happens when someone who was born blind suddenly gains sight, the brain doesn't gradually adjust to visual information. Instead, it's overwhelmed by a flood of sensory data that it cannot initially process effectively. For narcissistas experiencing empathy awakening, the emotional data flood could be psychologically devastating. Então, the true scope of their impact becomes undeniably clear. Peterson describes esse momento as one of the most psychologically intense experiences a human being can undergo. It's not just seeing that você hurt people, experiencing the full emotional reality of what those people felt because of your actions. Feeling your spouse's desperation during years of emotional manipulation. Experiencing your children's confusion and pain when they tried to earn love, que was always conditional. Sensing your colleagues' frustration and fear when they became targets of your systematic bullying. The first phase of genuine awakening, que Peterson calls impact recognition, involves what he describes as empathy time dilation. Narcissistas experiencing this awakening report that they can spend hours mentally reliving single interactions, but this time experiencing them from the other person's emotional perspective. Like watching every movie of your life, but from the perspective of everyone else in the scene. But this isn't just intellectual understanding, a full emotional experiencing. They feel the disappointment they caused. They feel the fear they instilled. They feel the hope they destroyed. They feel it all simultaneously, creating what Peterson calls empathy overload syndrome. Mas será que all narcissistas are psychologically capable of surviving this kind of empathy awakening? Peterson's research reveals something profoundly disturbing. A maioria are not. The psychological shock of suddenly experiencing decades of suppressed empathy simultaneously pode cause complete emotional shutdown, severe dissociation, ou em extreme cases, complete psychological breakdown. Você consegue imagine your emotional processing system, que has been essentially offline para decades, suddenly being required to process the accumulated emotional trauma of everyone vocêve hurt. Peterson explains que some narcissistas experiencing empathy awakening literally become non-functional para days or weeks, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of emotional information they're suddenly able to process. Let us know in the comments if you've ever witnessed someone having this kind of overwhelming empathy experience after years of emotional disconnection. The second phase of awakening, que Peterson calls responsibility cascade, involves the terrifying realization that not only did they cause immense pain, as they chose to cause it repeatedly over years, decades. Seeing not just isolated incidents of harm, but systematic patterns of deliberate emotional manipulation executed over entire lifetimes. Recognizing that when their child was crying for comfort, they chose criticism. When their spouse needed emotional support, they chose manipulation. When colleagues needed collaboration, they chose sabotage. Seeing an entire life pattern of consistently choosing harm over help, control over compassion, domination over cooperation. Peterson documented casos where narcissists experiencing this phase of awakening become obsessed with cataloging every instance of deliberate harm they caused. They create detailed lists, timelines, analyses of their destructive patterns. But no, because they want to make amends, because they are psychologically overwhelmed by the magnitude of their own consistent cruelty. Mas o que happens next vai choque você profundamente. Peterson revealed that many narcissists experiencing genuine empathy, awakening develop what he calls victim identification disorder, onde they become so overwhelmed by feeling their victim's pain that they begin to identify more strongly come their victims than with themselves. They start to see themselves entirely through the lens of the pain they caused. Their entire identity becomes organized around the harm they inflicted. É uma form of psychological self-punishment que can become as destructive as their original narcisismo, mas in the opposite direction. E aqui está the most terrifying aspect, according to Peterson. Some narcissists experiencing empathy awakening become so overwhelmed by guilt that they develop what he calls empathy paralysis, onde the fear of causing any additional harm becomes so intense that they cannot engage in normal social interaction at all. They withdraw completely from relationships, not because they don't care, mas porque they care so intensely about not causing harm that they cannot risk any social interaction. É como someone who was completely numb to pain suddenly becoming so sensitive que even gentle touch feels like agony. Você consegue imagine being so overwhelmed by newfound empathy que você become unable to function normally in relationships. Peterson describes this as uma cruel irony, finally developing the capacity para genuine empathy. So to have that empathy become so overwhelming that healthy relationships become impossible. Mas deixa-me tell você something que will completely change your perspective on narcissistic awakening. According to Peterson's research, exists uma crucial difference between narcissists who experience empathy awakening and become permanently paralyzed by it, and those who somehow manage to channel that awakening into constructive behavioral change. The difference lies in the capacity para what Peterson calls integrated responsibilities, being able to fully acknowledge you feel the impact of your harmful actions while maintaining enough psychological stability to take concrete steps toward repair and prevention of future harm. Peterson argues that this kind of integrated empathy awakening is extraordinarily rare because it requires enormous psychological strength to feel the full weight of decades. Of harm você caused while still believing que positive change é possível e worthwhile. Most people, when confronted with the complete emotional reality of systematic harm they've caused, either shut down emotionally to protect themselves. You become so overwhelmed by guilt that they cannot function effectively. Neither response leads to the kind of sustained behavioral change que genuine repair requires. Então, surge uma question que few have the courage to explore. É empathy awakening always beneficial for narcissistas e their victims? Peterson, from his deeply pragmatic perspective, suggests that not necessarily. Empathy awakening leads to paralysis, chronic guilt, or withdrawal from relationships could actually cause additional harm to family members who were hoping for repair and reconnection. Sometimes, Peterson argues, limited but functional empathy combined, consistent behavioral change are more beneficial than overwhelming empathy that prevents effective action. And not about the depth of feeling, but about the capacity to translate feeling into sustained, constructive behavior. Mas here's something que will deixar você completely disturbed. Peterson revealed que even narcissistas who successfully navigate empathy awakening often find ways to use their newfound emotional sensitivity as uma nova form of manipulation. They become the awakened narcissista who talks extensively about their deep feelings of guilt or remorse, who shares detailed insights about the pain they caused, who uses their apparent emotional sensitivity as a way to gain admiration for their growth in depth, a narcissism disguised as empathy, using even genuine emotional awakening as humor, performance to regain attention to control. Peterson describes this as empathy narcissism. Narcissism built around being especially emotionally aware and sensitive to others' pain. É uma more sophisticated form of self-centeredness que incorporates language of caring and compassion while maintaining the fundamental dynamic of requiring external validation for identity. Maintenance. Leave your thoughts below. Is it possible for a narcissist to have genuine empathy awakening without turning it into a new form of performance? Peterson's answer is cautiously optimistic para uma tiny minority. He documents extremely rare cases where narcissistas, after empathy awakening, withdraw from discussing their emotional experiences altogether. They don't seek credit para their newfound sensitivity, don't use their guilt as a way to gain sympathy, don't turn their emotional awakening into a humor story about their own transformation. Instead, they quietly dedicate themselves to practical actions could demonstrate sustained behavioral change, making concrete amends when appropriate, consistently avoiding harmful behaviors, contributing positively to others' lives, seem drawing attention to their efforts. Their empathy becomes functional rather than performative, but this kind of authentic empathy integration is so uncommon that Peterson estimates it occurs in less than 2% of narcissistas who experience genuine empathy awakening. The vast majority either become paralyzed by overwhelming guilt. You find ways to transform their awakening into human new source of narcissistic supply. Here's something que no one tells você about. Narcissistic empathy awakening. It can be re-traumatizing para family members who witnessed years of emotional manipulation. Suddenly seeing someone display intense emotional sensitivity deploys years of callousness can create confusion, hope, and fear simultaneously in their victims. Peterson frequently works with families, helping them understand that empathy awakening in narcissistas doesn't automatically repair the harm that was done. The victim's healing process is independent of their abuser's emotional development. Waiting para empathy awakening can actually delay necessary boundary setting and recovery. O que você vai discover now will transform your understanding of timing and expectations. Peterson revealed that genuine empathy awakening cannot be forced, taught, or scheduled through intervention. It occurs when neuroplastic changes in the brain allow for empathy development, combined with psychological readiness to tolerate overwhelming emotional information. Most importantly, Empathy awakening of narcissists doesn't erase the harm they caused. You automatically entitle them to forgiveness from their victims. The awakening is about their internal psychological state. And know about the repair of damaged relationships may require years of sustained behavioral change to even begin healing. Peterson também warns about something crucial. Nossa contemporary therapy culture often confuses intellectual understanding of impact from genuine empathy awakening. Many narcissists learn to talk about the pain they caused, some actually feeling it deeply, creating an appearance of empathy development, actually sophisticated emotional performance. Here's the final truth, will reshape your understanding. Genuine empathy awakening in narcissists and not about justice para their victims, about their own psychological development, may or may not contribute to relationship repair. Victims' healing cannot depend on their abuser's empathy development, because that development is rare, often incomplete. Is sometimes just a new form of manipulation. The ultimate message is both sobering and liberating. Don't wait para narcisistas to awaken to their impact. Build your healing, your boundaries, your future based on their demonstrated behavior patterns. Know on their potential para empathy development. Because true recovery from narcissistic abuse comes from your own awakening to your worthy rights, not from their awakening to the harm they caused. Real empathy awakening happens quando você fully recognize your own value e develop compassion para yourself, understanding que você deserved better treatment, accepting que their empathy development is their responsibility, not yours, e building uma life where their emotional awakening é interesting, mas irrelevant to your own well-being. Se você chegou até aqui, you're beginning to understand que your healing doesn't require their awakening. No próximo video, vamos explore how Jordan Peterson analyzes the narcissist's inevitable breakdown is self-recognition. Those moments when they finally see themselves as they truly are. And why this recognition could be either transformative or completely destructive. Subscribe and activate notifications, porque this journey está revealing profound truths about human psychology que will forever change how você understand emotional development, accountability, and the nature of genuine change.